What happens when an old story refuses to stay buried? Across deserts, river valleys, mountain monasteries, and ruined cities, human beings have always looked upward and asked the same question in different languages. What did we witness? What did our ancestors try to tell us? In tablets of clay, in brittle scrolls, in epics carried by memory before they were ever written down, there are passages that do not read like simple legend. They read like people reaching for words large enough to hold what they had seen. Not proof, not certainty, something more fragile than that. A trace. Again and again, the pattern returns. A light no one can explain. A sound that seems to shake the order of the world. A figure descending from the sky, or a force so immense it leaves behind silence instead of understanding. Priests record it. Poets reshape it. Empires file it away. Later generations inherit the echo, but not the event itself. What survives is part memory, part metaphor, part warning. Maybe that is how the deepest human experiences endure, not as clean facts, but as stories worn smooth by time. This journey begins there in the space between history and imagination, where fear becomes ritual and observation becomes myth. We are not here to force ancient texts into modern categories, or to pretend mystery is the same thing as evidence. We are here for something quieter and perhaps more honest, to listen carefully to the past and notice how often it speaks in the language of astonishment. Because behind these accounts of burning skies, thunderous machines, and radiant visitors lies a more intimate question. Not whether our ancestors understood everything they saw, but whether we are too confident that we understand them. And so we begin, not with answers, but with attention. In the oldest stories on Earth, something is still waiting to be heard. What if the first mystery was written in wet clay beside a river? Long before paper, before bound books, before the idea of history as we know it, there were hands pressing symbols into soft tablets under the light of Mesopotamian skies. The people of Sumer and Akkad lived close to the moods of the earth. Their fields depended on rivers that could nourish or destroy. Their cities rose from mud brick and prayer. Above them stretched a night sky so vast, so unbroken by modern light, that every change in it must have felt personal. In those early records, the heavens were never distant. They moved with intention. They watched, warned, and sometimes seemed to descend. Certain texts speak of blazing presences, of divine beings wrapped in radiance, of moments when the boundary between sky and ground appeared to thin. To a modern reader, the language can feel uncannily vivid. Wheels of light, terrible brightness. Voices emerging from the storm. But ancient people were not writing science reports. They were describing experience through the only framework they had, the sacred. The unknown did not arrive as a puzzle to be solved. It arrived as a power to be honored, feared, or survived. A strange event in the sky became a message. A violent burst of weather became a sign. What mattered was not only what happened, but what it meant for the fragile human world below. And still, something in these accounts resists easy dismissal. Not because they prove anything extraordinary, but because they preserve the raw texture of human bewilderment. You can almost feel the scribe pausing, searching for the least inadequate word. How do you write down a light that seemed alive? How do you describe motion no one has seen before? How do you make mystery fit into language made for ordinary days? Perhaps that is why these first tablets still hold us. They remind us that wonder is older than explanation. At the beginning of recorded memory, people were already standing beneath the unknown, trying to turn astonishment into meaning. Could a pillar of fire mean more than fire? In the Hebrew Bible, some of the most enduring images arrive not as explanations, but as encounters. A bush that burns without being consumed. A mountain hidden inside smoke and thunder. A people moving through wilderness, guided by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. These scenes have lived for centuries in the religious imagination, yet they also carry the texture of direct experience. They feel immediate, almost physical, as if someone once stood at a distance, watched the horizon change, and struggled to name what followed. For believers, these passages speak of divine presence. For historians, they reveal how ancient communities understood danger, authority, and survival. For everyone else, they open a more delicate question. What happens when an event is so overwhelming that description becomes symbolic? The language of scripture is often poetic, but poetry is not the opposite of truth. Sometimes it is what remains when literal language breaks under the weight of what was seen. The wilderness itself matters here. In a landscape stripped of comfort, every light is sharper, every sound more exposed. A storm over stone can feel like judgment. A rare atmospheric glow can seem like guidance. A mountain trembling under weather and fear can become the stage on which a people believes it has met the sacred. The event and the meaning begin to merge until they can no longer be separated. That is why these texts endure beyond doctrine. They are not simply declaring belief. They are recording what it feels like to be small before something immense, to stand in uncertainty and sense, rightly or wrongly, that the world is speaking. Maybe that is the deeper mystery in these ancient scenes. Not whether fire descended exactly as written, but how generations preserved the memory of being led by something they could not control and never fully understand. Even now, the image remains, a moving light in darkness and human beings choosing to follow it. What if the sky was once read like a living manuscript? In the ancient world, Egypt watched the heavens with a patience few civilizations could match. The stars were not decoration. They were clocks, omens, companions to ritual, and markers of eternity. Along the Nile, where life depended on rhythms larger than any one ruler, the sky offered both order and surprise. Most nights confirmed what people already knew. But every so often, something appeared that did not belong to the usual script. Later texts and contested accounts speak of unusual lights, circles of fire, and luminous forms crossing the heavens. Scholars debate the reliability of such descriptions, and wisely so. Ancient documents pass through many hands. Translation introduces distortion. Memory, especially across centuries, can turn observation into legend. Yet even uncertainty tells us something. It shows how deeply people wish to preserve moments that disturb the normal balance between earth and sky. Imagine the scene. Priests on temple grounds. Scribes trained to notice deviation. A civilization devoted to continuity, confronted by an event it could not easily place among known stars, planets, or weather. In that moment, our record-keeping becomes more than administration. It becomes an act of steadiness. If the world has shifted, even briefly, then writing it down is a way of restoring form. The Egyptian imagination did not divide the cosmos into neat modern categories. Divine order, natural cycles, kingship, and celestial motion belonged to the same woven fabric. So when something strange appeared overhead, the question was never only what is it? The deeper question was what does it disturb and what does it reveal about our place in the order of things? That may be why these fragments still fascinate us. They do not offer certainty, they offer a human response to uncertainty. A bright anomaly passes over a dark river, and somewhere below, someone lifts their eyes, reaches for language, and discovers that observation is sometimes the beginning of reverence. Can an epic preserve the memory of a catastrophe by turning it into a dream? In India's ancient literature, the line between cosmic vision and lived experience is rarely simple. The great epics do not move like chronicles. They breathe, they circle, they return to the same questions through war, kinship, duty, and loss. And within that vast moral landscape are moments that feel startlingly concrete, dazzling weapons that shine like many suns, chariots that move with uncanny force, skies disturbed by a blast of heat, wind, and ash. It is tempting from a modern distance to read these passages as predictions or hidden technologies, but that impulse can flatten the richer truth of the text. The Mahabharata and related traditions are not manuals disguised as myth. They are meditations on power. They ask what happens when human beings gain access to forces beyond their wisdom. They imagine devastation on a scale so profound that ordinary speech begins to fail. That is where the mystery lives. Not in proving that ancient poets witnessed machines, but in noticing how carefully they describe the emotional atmosphere of overwhelming destruction. Birds falling silent, water poisoned, survivors disoriented, a brightness too fierce to face directly. These are not just decorative flourishes. They are the details of people trying to imagine or remember what it means for the world to become unrecognizable in a single moment. And perhaps that is why the passages still unsettle readers today. They belong to another age, yet they speak to a fear that feels modern. That our reach may exceed our understanding, that brilliance without restraint can leave behind only grief. The epic widens the lens beyond battle itself and asks what remains after awe hardens into consequence. In the end, the ancient text offers no simple decoding key. It offers something more enduring. The image of civilization standing at the edge of its own power, dazzled by what it can summon, and uncertain whether wisdom can keep pace with wonder. What if a vision becomes more powerful because no one can agree on what was seen? In the book of Ezekiel, the scene opens with weather. A storm rises from the north. Clouds gather. Fire folds into itself. Then, within that turbulence, the prophet describes something that has challenged readers for centuries. Living beings, intersecting wheels, flashes of light, a radiant vault overhead. It is one of the most intricate visions in ancient literature, at once intimate and impossible, grounded in sensory detail yet resistant to any stable image. Some rate it as theology in its purest form, a symbolic revelation of divine majesty. Others approach it as literature shaped by exile, trauma, and the need to imagine order in a world that had collapsed. Still others are struck by the precision of the imagery itself, by the sense that Ezekiel is not inventing freely so much as straining to describe something that exceeded familiar language. The fascination endures because the text seems to hover between metaphor and report. But perhaps the lasting force of the vision lies elsewhere. Ezekiel does not offer calm interpretation first. He gives us disorientation, motion within motion, sound like rushing waters, brightness that cannot be looked at directly. This is not the language of certainty. It is the language of encounter, when the mind reaches the edge of what it can organize and can only keep naming fragments as they pass. That makes the passage feel strangely modern. We know what it is to live among images that outpace understanding, to witness events before we know how to frame them. Ezekiel's vision reminds us that the oldest texts were already wrestling with perception itself. What do we trust in a moment of overwhelming experience? The eye, the symbol, the meaning that arrives later? The answer may be that human beings have always needed all three. We see something. We shape it into story. Then we live for generations inside the story, still wondering what first gave rise to it. In that sense, the mystery is not a flaw in the record. It is the record. What survives when a civilization collapses is often not certainty, but an image. In the Greek world, myth was never only entertainment. It was a vessel for memory, a way of carrying fragments of weather, war, migration, and fear across generations that had no archive except the spoken voice. By the time these stories were written down, they had already lived many lives. They had passed through firesides, marketplaces, temples, and ships crossing dark water. Each retelling sharpened some details and softened others, until history and imagination learned to share the same breath. That may be why so many Greek tales begin with a disturbance in the natural order, a sun that seems to turn against the earth, a thunderbolt unlike ordinary storm, a figure descending in brilliance, a craftsman of impossible skill, building devices that feel half mechanical, half divine. The language is mythic, yes, but the emotional logic is recognizably human. Something happened that felt larger than explanation, and the mind answered with story. Consider how often Greek myth returns to the danger of seeing too much. Semele consumed by radiance, Phaethon unable to master the chariot of the sun, Icarus rising on borrowed wings only to learn that wonder without wisdom has a cost. These are not technical accounts of mysterious phenomena, yet they preserve a pattern we have seen before. 4. Light, ascent, fire, collapse. Beneath the symbolic surface lies an old meditation on human limits. And perhaps that is what keeps these stories alive. They are not asking us to treat myth as hidden engineering or lost science. They are asking something more uncomfortable. What do we do with power we can imagine more easily than we can govern? What happens when our desire to reach beyond ourselves outruns our understanding of consequence? In the Greek imagination, the sky is both invitation and warning. It calls to human ambition, then reminds us how fragile ambition becomes in the face of forces it cannot command. Maybe that is why these ancient stories still feel so close. They understand that awe is never innocent for long. What if the most enduring mysteries are the ones carried across an ocean in silence? In the Popol Vuh and in the scattered records of Mesoamerican memory, the world is never fixed. It is made, tested, broken, and remade. Light arrives after long darkness. Human beings are shaped through trial and error. The sky is not a passive backdrop, but an active participant in creation, timekeeping, and fate. Among the Maya especially, celestial movement was observed with extraordinary care, yet it was never reduced to mere calculation. The heavens were precise, but they were also alive with meaning. That dual vision matters. In Mesoamerican thought, astronomy and reverence were not opposites. A bright object crossing the sky, an eclipse, a comet, an unfamiliar glow near the horizon, all could be observed with rigor and still received as part of a sacred order. The watcher did not have to choose between measurement and wonder. Both belonged to the same act of attention. To study the sky was also to enter a conversation with time itself. Many of the surviving texts are incomplete, broken by conquest, fire, and translation. What remains often comes to us through fragments and echoes, and yet those fragments are enough to reveal a civilization deeply attuned to patterns most of us no longer notice. The cycle of Venus, the mood of seasons, the return of light to temple stairs at exactly the expected hour. When something fell outside those patterns, it would not have been ignored. It would have been felt as a disruption in a carefully tended harmony. There is something deeply moving in that. A people can lose cities, libraries, and names and still leave behind evidence of profound attention. Their mystery is not that they knew something magical and secret. It is that they watched the world so closely that even the smallest deviation carried weight. Perhaps that is what these old American skies still ask of us. Not belief without question, but attention without arrogance. To look up as they did and remember that knowledge begins in humility before what we do not yet understand. How do you describe a phenomenon when your language has been shaped to honor balance, not conquer mystery? In early Chinese chronicles, the sky was observed with extraordinary discipline. Court astronomers watched for comets, eclipses, halos, meteors, and any break in the expected rhythm of the heavens. Their task was not casual curiosity. The cosmos and the state were understood as reflections of one another. A strange light in the night, a star where no star belonged, or a sound accompanying an unusual celestial event could be recorded not just as spectacle, but as a disturbance in the moral and natural order. And yet the tone of many of these records is strikingly restrained. There is no rush toward grand declaration. A luminous object appears. It moves. It lingers. It vanishes. The description is often spare, almost elegant, as if precision itself were a form of respect. That restraint gives the mystery more weight, not less. When a careful observer chooses to record what does not fit the pattern, the silence around the words becomes part of the meaning. Over centuries, these accounts accumulated into a quiet archive of anomalies. Some can be explained through astronomy, weather, or the natural behavior of light. Others remain uncertain, not because they defy reason, but because the conditions of the original experience are lost to time. We inherit only the outline, a witness, an event, a notation preserved against oblivion. The rest has dissolved. But perhaps that is enough. Chinese thought has long made room for paradox, for the idea that the world can be ordered and still exceed our grasp. The unknown is not always an enemy to be exposed. Sometimes it is a reminder that reality contains more patterns than any one era can name. A mystery, then, does not humiliate knowledge, it deepens it. That may be the lesson carried in these old observations of wandering lights and unfamiliar signs. Human beings can look with rigor, write with care, and still leave room for wonder. In that space between record and meaning, the past remains alive, asking us to notice how much can be seen without ever being fully possessed. What if the strangest records are not the loudest ones, but the ones copied quietly by candlelight? In medieval Europe, knowledge often survived in fragments. A monk in a stone room, a chronicler bent over parchment, a marginal note added years after the main text was finished. The age is often imagined as closed and superstitious, but that picture is too simple. These were centuries of careful watching as well as belief, of observation filtered through theology seasonal hardship, and the long memory of classical worlds already fading into legend. Within these chronicles appear moments that still feel unexpectedly vivid. Crosses of light suspended in the sky, fiery shields drifting above towns, a blood-red moon hanging over battlefields, stars that seem to move against the known order of the heavens. Sometimes the tone is devotional, sometimes fearful, and sometimes almost administrative. The event is noted because it happened, because others saw it, because it seemed too unusual to leave unrecorded. Of course, the medieval eye did not divide the world the way we do. A solar halo, a comet, an aurora, a meteor storm, a rare atmospheric effect, all could carry spiritual meaning without losing their physical reality. To witness an anomaly was to stand at the intersection of nature and significance. The sky was never just weather. It was also text, and many believed it could be read. That belief did not always produce clarity. In times of plague, war, or famine, unusual sights above could gather fear around them, becoming symbols of judgment or warning. Yet there is something deeply human in that response. When ordinary life becomes fragile, people search the horizon for signs that suffering belongs to a larger story. The heavens, immense and indifferent, become a screen onto which hope and dread are projected alike. Maybe that is why these medieval records still matter. They show that mystery does not vanish in educated societies. It simply changes language. Even in an age of scriptoria and doctrine, human beings still looked up, saw something they could not fully place, and felt the old ache to connect event with meaning. In that ache, the centuries between them and us grow strangely small. What do we really inherit from the past? Events themselves or the stories people built to survive them? By the early modern era, the world had begun to change its language. Observation became more systematic. Instruments improved. Travel widened the known map of the earth and sky. Yet the old mysteries did not disappear. They simply entered a new threshold, where chronicles, natural philosophy, religious belief, and first-hand testimony all overlapped in uneasy ways. A strange event was no longer only a sign from heaven, but not yet only a problem for science. In this period, reports of unusual lights, noises from clear skies, luminous apparitions, and unexplained celestial forms continued to circulate through letters, journals, town records, and printed pamphlets. Some witnesses described them with sober detail. Others reached instinctively for older language: omen, wonder, portent. The modern mind was being born, but it was born carrying ancient habits of interpretation. That tension is important. It reminds us that reason does not arrive all at once and replace mystery. Human beings move gradually. We keep old metaphors even as new methods emerge. We learn to measure, but we still feel awe. We improve our explanations, but we remain vulnerable to the emotional force of what we cannot immediately classify. The transition itself becomes part of the story. And maybe that is why these accounts from the threshold between old worlds and new ones feel so intimate. They sound like people standing in two ages at once, one foot planted in inherited belief, the other stepping toward inquiry. They are not foolish for hesitating between the two. They are human. Most of us still live there now, balancing evidence and imagination, precision and longing. So when we read these records today, the question is no longer only what happened in the sky or sea or silence of a distant century. The deeper question is what each age does with uncertainty. Do we turn it into doctrine, dismiss it too quickly, or let it remain open long enough to teach us something about ourselves? Perhaps history matters most not when it solves the mystery, but when it shows us how mystery shapes the minds that try to name it. What if the hardest thing to recover is not the event, but the state of mind of the witness? Modern readers often approach ancient and pre-modern texts with a quiet impatience. We want to decode them. We want to separate weather from symbol, astronomy from theology, fact from embellishment. That instinct is understandable. It is part of the discipline of history. But it can also make the past seem flatter than it was, as if earlier people were merely confused versions of us, waiting for better tools to correct them. The truth is more demanding. Every account of a mysterious phenomenon is filtered through culture, fear, memory, and language, including our own. The person who saw a radiant object over a river, a terrifying storm around a mountain, or a light moving against expectation was not a passive camera. They were a human being shaped by ritual, community, obligation, and hope. What they recorded was never just the event. It was the event as lived. That does not make the record useless. It makes it richer. It asks us to read with two kinds of attention at once. One looks outward, asking what natural cause might explain the description. The other looks inward, asking what the witness believed was at stake. Was this a warning, a visitation, a disruption of order, a sign of judgment, or simply a moment when the world became strange? Different answers reveal different civilizations, but they also reveal something shared. Across continents and centuries, the pattern is hauntingly familiar. People confront what exceeds their categories, and in that moment, they do what humans have always done. They narrate. They compare the unknown to fire, wind, wheels, shining metal, divine beings, thunder, music, breath. They borrow from the visible world to speak about something that may not have fitted at all. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath all these texts. Mystery is never received in a pure form. It arrives inside a human life. And when that life reaches for language, it leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind a portrait of consciousness under pressure, trying not just to describe the world, but to remain whole inside it. Why do these stories still follow us into the present, long after their worlds have vanished? Perhaps because they are not only about strange lights, impossible visions, or forgotten phenomena. They are about the unfinished work of being human. Each text we have followed, from clay tablet to sacred verse to imperial record, reveals the same fragile drama. A person encounters something that unsettles the known world, then tries to carry that disturbance into language without losing its force. In that effort, history and imagination do not oppose each other. They collaborate. Modern science has given us extraordinary tools. It has explained comets that once inspired dread, storms once treated as omens, and celestial motions once wrapped in myth. That achievement matters. It has saved us from superstition, sharpened our understanding, and widened the field of what can be known. But explanation does not erase the emotional truth preserved in older accounts. To understand a phenomenon is not the same as understanding what it felt like to witness it before any explanation existed. And that feeling may be the thread connecting ancient observers to us. We too live in a world where knowledge expands faster than wisdom, where images travel before meaning arrives, where people confront events that seem to outrun language. The technologies have changed. The nervous system has not. We still look for metaphors when facts feel insufficient. We still turn towards story when reality appears too large, too sudden, or too strange. So these old narratives remain alive, not because they contain secret answers locked away from history, but because they reveal a permanent condition of human life. We are interpreters by nature. We stand beneath what exceeds us and begin instinctively to translate. Sometimes our translations are beautiful. Sometimes they are flawed. Often they are both. As this journey nears its end, one truth comes into focus. Mystery is not merely a gap in knowledge waiting to be closed. It is also a mirror. In trying to understand what ancient people saw, we begin to see how we ourselves respond to uncertainty, wonder, and the limits of explanation. And that recognition may be the most enduring revelation of all. In the end, what do we owe the past? Belief, skepticism, or something gentler than both? We began with old texts describing what seemed to exceed ordinary understanding. A light that moved with intention, a fire that did not behave like fire, a storm that became a voice, a vision so intricate that centuries later it still resists a single interpretation. Across cultures, the details changed, but the underlying gesture remained the same. Human beings looked at the unknown and refused to let it pass unnoticed. That refusal is one of the quiet foundations of civilization. It gave rise to myth, scripture, ritual, astronomy, philosophy, and eventually science itself. Before there were laboratories, there was attention. Before there were theories, there were witnesses. The first task was simply to see, then to remember, then to tell the story in a way that others might carry forward. Every age has done this differently, but none has escaped the need. What changes over time is not the existence of mystery, but our relationship to it. Some generations bend it toward reverence, others toward measurement, Some fear it, others romanticize it. But perhaps the most honest response is neither surrender nor dismissal. Perhaps it is a disciplined humility, a willingness to let ancient voices remain partly strange while still taking their wonder seriously. Because these texts, whatever their precise causes, are not relics of ignorance. They are records of human attention at its limits. They show us people confronting a world larger than their language and choosing still to speak. In that choice, there is courage. There is imagination. There is the beginning of all inquiry. So the final question may not be whether every mystery can be solved. It may be whether we can remain worthy of mystery without abusing it. Whether we can listen to old stories without forcing them into certainty and look at our own world with the same alertness our ancestors brought to theirs. The sky is no less vast now than it was then. Memory is still incomplete. Truth is still approached in fragments. And somewhere between what can be explained and what can only be felt, the human story continues, still looking up.